Home-brewed Christianity. This is Bo Sanders, and in our ongoing quest to provide you with the best ingredients to brew your own faith with your community in your location, we have brought on what we believe is our first interview with an intelligent design scientist. Dr. Stephen C. Meyer is a Cambridge-trained. Well, he's in the philosophy of science. He's a former geophysicist, and now he's at the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. His books are Darwin's Doubt and The Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. Now, it needs to be said that sometimes we interview people that we are not 100% sure we agree with 100%. In fact, on a fairly regular basis, we go out of our way to talk with people who we don't agree with 100%. And sometimes that throws people off, and they think that we should only have people on who we can endorse 100% of their project. But that's not our style. So we welcome Dr. Meyer and his intelligent design perspective into this conversation. We hope that you get something out of it. And we want to thank Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, who is our sponsor this month. The Seattle School focuses on educating the whole person through scripture and tradition, personal formation, and cultural engagement. This practical approach equips pastors, therapists, social sector leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs with the intellectual capacity, the emotional intelligence, and cultural competency needed to thrive in their vocation. Students learn to build transformative relationships with their clients, parishioners, and communities to fulfill the mission of the church and engage the kingdom of God. The Seattle School offers master-level degrees in divinity, theology and culture, and counseling psychology. You are invited to learn more about the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology degree programs at the seattleschool.edu, and we thank them for their sponsorship this month. So, before we delve into this, I just want to mention quickly in passing that we have several exciting events coming up, so check in often at the website. Sign up for both the live events. If you are headed to Baltimore in a couple weeks, I will see you there at AAR, the American Academy of Religion. And we have 2 events that we're participating in there. I look forward to seeing you. Let us know your feedback on this episode. I'm sure that there will be lots of thoughts and pushback, concerns, and questions, as this is our first interview with an intelligent design scientist. So, go to the speak pipe on the homepage, the little microphone on the right-hand side, click on it, leave us an MP3. We will use it on an upcoming podcast, or you can just let us know that you listened to the episode and what your thoughts were. We love your feedback. We have one request. Don't forget to share the brew.
Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today we are joined by Stephen Meyer, PhD in Philosophy of Science from the University of Cambridge. And right now, his new book, Darwin's Doubt, is popping all over the New York Times bestsellers list. He's also the author of Signature in the Cell and part of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. So, and on Homebrewed Christianity, we've done a lot of religion and science types, but today we not only will get to talk about intelligent design, but by one of its leading brains in the movement and such. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining on the podcast.
I'm really glad to be with you, Trev.
So maybe before we jump in, you're a philosopher of science. We've had philosophers of science on before, but maybe you could kind of just say, as someone who works in this field that's trying to kind of cross the boundaries of the scientific discipline and look at the big metaphysical and philosophical questions, but also in a particular area that's tied to faith commitments and being a theist and that kind of thing. maybe you could tell how you got to your own vocation as a philosopher of science and being invested in the scientific conversation about life, its meaning and origin.
Yeah, absolutely. I started out in the field of geophysics. I'd done 2 college science majors, one in geology, one in physics, and then I worked for an oil company in the exploration department doing exploration geophysics for about 4 years. And while I was working in that field, my own interests in philosophy and philosophy of science were continuing to develop. I'd taken a minor in philosophy in college, but I found that I was really attracted to questions at the intersection between science and philosophy. Questions, obviously, of epistemology, how we know what we know, but also questions about what science has to say about the big metaphysical issues, particularly issues of origins. And in 1985, when I was 3 or 4 years into all this, a conference came to the city where I was working that was addressing exactly those kind of questions. It was a conference on the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the nature and origin of human consciousness. And the conference was divided between scientists and philosophers who were of a theistic persuasion and those who were of a decidedly materialistic, agnostic, or atheistic persuasion. And I was struck in the discussions as I listened as just a member of the audience that how much the initiative seemed to have shifted in the key conversations to the theistic side. And the topic, the discussion of the origin of life in particular grabbed my interest. A book had just been published the year before called The Mystery of Life's Origin. It happened that the lead author of that book lived in the city where I lived. After the conference, I got to know him, and we began to discuss his thesis, which was essentially a critique of all standard, what are known as chemical evolutionary theories, theories that purport to explain the origin of the first life from simpler non-living chemicals. And then, and also he was floating the idea that the complexity of the cell, in particular its informational complexity, might be pointing to something more than just undirected material processes. He suggested that maybe it was necessary to begin to talk about intelligent causes as part of the explanation for the origin of life, which question had brought this discipline of chemical evolutionary theory to something of an impasse by the 80s, from which it really hasn't recovered. So my first book, Signature in the Cell, was actually about that question of the origin of life, and it was a result of really 25 years of research that followed from my discussions with Charles Thaxton, the author of the book that I was mentioning, and my own subsequent PhD work in the philosophy of science at Cambridge University, which I took up a year or so after I first met Dr. Thaxton and attended that conference. So in a way, the conference sparked or piqued an interest that was developing in me about these questions that lie at the boundary or the intersection between science and philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things about the questions of origin is that unlike kind of other parts of scientific discourse, right? There's so much other parts of culture that are connected to it. When we talk about origins and how to explain kind of the scientific consensus and then data that doesn't quite fit in things, we're also having a conversation, even if we can't say it out loud, about politics and what goes on right in public education and also religion and what are those implications. And it gets really messy. And one of the things I've found really helpful about philosophy of science is that it actually looks at how those connections get made in kind of an intellectually rigorous way. It doesn't just go, here's this science thing, therefore here's what's true theologically. And when looking at your book and thinking about it, I wonder if that is real difficult in your situation where you're wanting to have a conversation in your book that if you're not a scientist or familiar with how to read it and how scientific consensus gets developed and the new ideas or data have to create a new thesis and this kind of thing, how do you negotiate that kind of critical thinking, looking at data and that kind of part, while at the same time recognizing that plenty of people are just going to buy the book and also wave it around for their the political purpose, or how they want to help in the education system and have more theories there, or no, now we know that therefore intelligent design equals the God of Abraham and that kind of thing. So as a philosopher of science who both is located in religious community and those commitments, but also trying to do the hard work of philosophy and science, how do you negotiate those boundaries with all the different audiences that you converse with?
Well, I think one of the things that's exciting about these origins issues is precisely that they break down those boundaries. However you answer the question about biological or cosmological origins, whether you affirm that there are strictly material processes that can account for all those big questions, or whether you think that there was a purposive intelligence or designing mind involved in the origin of life or the origin of the universe. Either one of those two basic answers to that fundamental question is going to raise larger worldview implications. And I think what's exciting is that the questions really are scientific now. And there are scientific theories that have been proposed, whether it's Darwinism or NeoDarwinism, or I think intelligent design is a scientific theory. But I think all those theories have larger implications, and that's part of what makes the investigations exciting. It's also part of what elicits sometimes very unhelpful emotional reactions from people. And I've seen that. I've just published a new book, Darwin's Doubt, and we saw this the night the book was released on Amazon, June 18th. There were already, by 3 o'clock in the morning, there were already a slew of negative reviews that had been uploaded from people who were clearly not readers of the book, but had been lying in wait for their opportunity to vote it up or down, the way things go on the internet these days. And some of the things have been, they're almost humorous. They're such emotional ranting. One particular person, one of the first reviews, said it was mendacious intellectual pornography, and I thought, gosh, that's quite an achievement to earn that kind of a moniker. So, anyway, yeah, I think that is both, the inherently interdisciplinary nature of these questions is part of what makes them exciting. It's part of what also makes it hard for people to discuss them in a calm, rational, cogent manner, both pro and con. And so I particularly appreciate people who are capable of doing that on both sides of the issue. I've had a long-time debating partner who is himself a staunch Darwinist, Michael Ruse, and I enjoy him very much because he's very genial and very capable of discussing not only the scientific but also the philosophical and theological implications of these discussions. And as it happens, I'm going to get to have a conversation with him on NPR soon coming up, and I'm looking forward to that. I've had them before. But I would say that Professor Ruse is actually something of an anomaly in that many people find that hard to do without resorting to ad hominem abuse and name-calling and that kind of thing. So anyway, it's a challenge. But, the philosophical training can actually be helpful because, we have basic rules of discourse like no personal attacks. You have to represent the other guy's position the way he himself would want it to be represented, no straw man, etc. And so as best I can, I try to keep to those guidelines in discourse and not devolve into the mudslinging, because that's not why I got into it, and it's not really very helpful. I mean,
yeah. And I saw videos at some point on the internet that kind of played like the popular discourse around kind of theories of life end up looking a lot like professional wrestling, and they were using kind of some of the kind of 7-day creationists versus Dawkins and they just come up with these witty one-liners and their special moves and that it's really a theatrical performance for people that already have picked sides as opposed to an investigation with both the data.
Yeah,
and stuff.
Systematic investigation of the relevant facts. I mean, the one thing I've not gotten accused of is writing witty one-liners, because both books I've written, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, have been very lengthy arguments, and arguments in the Darwinian tradition, because Darwin said in The Origin of in the Darwinian rhetorical tradition. Darwin argued that, described his book as one long argument for the idea of descent with modification, and I think that science progresses as scientists argue about how to interpret the evidence. There's an Italian philosopher of science, Marcel Opera, who has done a study of, in a sense, the scientific method, and shows that argumentation is critical because scientists are trying to explain the evidence, and they're often weighing and competing explanations of the same evidence, so that arguing about how best to interpret or best explain the evidence is critical to science. And so a good paradigm-setting piece of scientific work necessarily has to engage in a comprehensive kind of argument that lays out the facts, lays out the competing explanations, and then argues as to why one of those is best, and then addresses the counter-arguments to the interpretation that's provided. And that's the kind of structure you'll find in my books. Mm-hmm. But to make them interesting, I've also tried to tell a story in both cases. And in this most recent book, Darwin's Doubt, I tell the story of the doubt that Darwin himself had about his theory. And what's become of that doubt is there have been progressive attempts to resolve the mystery that he was concerned about, and how those attempts have actually progressively deepened that mystery and left us in a place in evolutionary biology where we now have leading evolutionary biologists trying to formulate new theories of evolution, and some even calling for new theories because they recognize that the standard NeoDarwinian theory that we all learn in the biology textbooks does not refer to a mechanism that has the creative power necessary to construct the fundamentally new forms of life that arise in the history of life.
Mm-hmm. In Darwin, in his book, and maybe you can explain this a little bit, because both your book's Signature and The Cell, when you're talking about DNA, obviously that's Darwin had no idea of what we were going to come to learn by looking at DNA. And then in Darwin's Doubt, you're looking at these kind of the explosion of new forms and shapes of life in the Cambrian period. And in many ways, the book itself is saying, in faithfulness to Darwin, evolutionary theory has to evolve, and it might actually, at least in the neo-Darwinistic form, become extinct as intellectually credible. And I wonder if you could say a bit about, when we use the phrase neo-Darwinism on the podcast before, people have used it, and it's usually in a negative way because either we had this big debate with Daniel Dennett and Philip Clayton once on the podcast, and that kind of thing. So, but when people think of just Darwin's theory prior to kind of the present form, think of like natural selection and mutation and modification that way. Actually,
with Darwin's theory, he doesn't have a concept of mutation, and that's what's new. That's the neo-Darwinism. Mm-hmm. Darwin talked about natural selection acting on random variations, and he hadn't yet read Mendel. He didn't know about genes. He didn't know about mutations in genes, and he didn't know about DNA. So neo-Darwinism is an attempt to incorporate all those new forms of genetic knowledge into the theory. And so the Darwinian variation upon which Darwin thought natural selection acted has been replaced by the notion of mutations in genetic material, mutations in the sequence of information carrying characters or bases in the DNA. Mm-hmm. So they're random changes in the digital characters in the DNA molecule. And so and that, for the modern neo-Darwinist, is the source of all innovation, of all creativity, of all novelty in the history of life. Natural selection is a sifting mechanism that eliminates the variations and mutations that are harmful and preserves the ones that are beneficial, advantageous, or functionally advantageous.
Mm-hmm. In Signature in the Cell, you deal more with the DNA question and how that works. And in this book, one of the things that gets called into doubt is common ancestry. So maybe you can say a little bit about how Darwin saw that and posits this doubt, and then what kind of recent scientific discoveries call into question the consensus of kind of common ancestry in evolution.
Well, maybe it'd be best to talk about the two books in sequence. The first book, Signature in the Cell, was addressing a question that Darwin didn't address, and that question is the origin of the first life. Darwin had in one letter, he made a speculation to a friend about life arising in a warm little pond with all the right phosphorus, salts, and various chemicals. But he made no attempt to explain it in the origin of species, and apart from that one speculative letter, really offered nothing by way of explanation for the origin of the first life. He was attempting to explain the origin of complex forms of life, starting from, as he put it, one or very few simple forms. And so the first book, Signature in the Cell, actually addressed the question of the origin of life and argued that the information necessary to produce the first life is best explained by a prior designing intelligence. And I made that argument based on our uniform and repeated experience of what it takes to generate information, especially information in a digital or alphabetic form as we find it in DNA. Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any that's ever been created. And if you think about that for a minute, it's a very suggestive observation, because we know from experience that computer programs, require programmers, intelligent agents. And we know more generally that information in whatever form we find it, whether it's in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or informational modulations of a radio signal, whenever we find information and trace it back to its ultimate source, we always get to a mind, not a material process. And so in Signature in the Cell, I argued that in light of the inability to account for the origin of the information in strictly materialistic or chemical terms within chemical evolutionary theory, and in light of what we know generally about what it does take to generate information, that intelligent design constitutes the best explanation for that information, the information necessary to produce the first life. Mm-hmm. So that was the first book. The second book, Darwin's Doubt, looks at a question that Darwin addressed, but a question about which he professed some concern, doubt, even ignorance, and that is the question of the origin of the first animals in the fossil record. He did a great job of discussing the second book, Darwin's Doubt. I'll just start over. The phone rang. Sorry. Okay, the second book, Darwin's Doubt, looks at a question that Darwin did address, but one which he acknowledged his theory couldn't really fully or adequately explain, and that is the question of the origin of the first animals as they're recorded in the fossil record. Darwin understood that his mechanism of natural selection acting on random variations had to work very slowly and gradually. And yet the first animal life appears in a period of geologic time known as the Cambrian, and it does so very abruptly. It's a geologically discontinuous event where suddenly in the fossil record you find these complex animal forms, and in the lower Precambrian strata, forms are not present. And so what I do in Darwin's Doubt is I start the story with his own doubt about the Cambrian explosion, and then show that doubt has grown up to be a real crisis in evolutionary biology, because the problem of the missing ancestral fossils has been made more acute by subsequent fossil finds, and more importantly, we've learned a lot since Darwin's time about what it takes to build an animal, and especially what the information that's necessary. We've learned a lot about the role of genetic and also what's called epigenetic information, and the importance of those forms of information to building and maintaining animal life. And I argue in the book for five separate reasons that the mechanism of mutation and natural selection is not adequate to account for the information necessary to build new forms of life. Essentially, there's an engineering problem here, and I have a section of the book called How to Build an Animal. And I show that the mutation selection mechanism is not sufficient to build these animal forms. And oddly, I also show that many leading evolutionary biologists are acknowledging the same thing, either explicitly or tacitly. Tacitly, in the case of those evolutionary biologists who are now formulating new theories of evolution or calling for them because they recognize that the mechanism of mutation and selection is not sufficient to build these new fundamentally new forms of animal life. Mutation and selection do a good job explaining the small changes in the history of life, the so-called microevolutionary change, but that mechanism is not adequate, say many evolutionary biologists, to account for the big changes. As one biologist puts it, natural selection explains the survival, but not the arrival of the fittest.
Mm-hmm. In the history of philosophy and these questions of cosmology, there's kind of been shifts back and forth between kind of materialist foundations and conclusions and idealist ones. All the way back to Plato, who is an idealist, and the early church fathers and that kind of thing. So I wonder if the kind of theory of information that's tied up in the intelligent design argument is a form of idealism, or would that be a leap to make?
No, I think it is a form of idealism. It's the idea. Idealism affirms that there is a mind prior to the structures that we see in matter, or rather that you can see evidence of a mind in the structure of matter. And that's an ancient philosophical tradition. It goes all the way back to the Greeks. And in fact, this question concerning biological and cosmological origins has typically admitted two main answers. One is the materialistic answer, which affirms that matter is eternal, self-existent, self-organizing, and self-creating. The other is the more idealistic, in the philosophical sense, answer, which affirms that a mind was involved in either shaping or creating matter, or both. And Plato had the demiurge concept, which had a mind shaping pre-existing matter. Mm-hmm. The Judeo-Christian tradition has affirmed the idea that there is the mind, namely the mind of God, that both created and shaped matter. And intelligent design is a scientific theory that affirms the primacy of mind over matter. In particular, the necessity of invoking mind to account for the informational arrangements or configurations of matter that we find in the biological world. And this is the amazing discovery of 20th century biology, is that at the foundation of life, what we have is not just matter and energy, but actually information, and that information is running the show inside living systems, both the information stored in the digital code in DNA, and as I mentioned, these higher forms of information that are now being discovered in biology called epigenetic forms of information. It's now clear that all the information necessary to build an animal is not present just in the DNA. There's additional layers of information, and that an animal is in fact a hierarchically organized system of information and information processing. Just absolutely fascinating discoveries that are being made. And I think because of what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world, namely is that it takes a mind or an intelligence to generate information, and this is consistent with everything we know. In fact, one information theorist who was a pioneer in the application of information theory to molecular biology said, almost in an offhand way, in a long essay that he wrote, that the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And so what I show in the book is that by applying the standard method of scientific reasoning about events in the remote past, the very method that Darwin himself used, it's possible to make a decisive scientific argument for intelligent design, because Darwin showed that if you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you should be looking for causes that are known from our present experience to have the capacity to produce the effect you're trying to explain. And when I came across that principle of reasoning in his work, I realized that applied directly to this question of the origin of information. Because what we know from experience, in our present and uniform experience of cause and effect, is that it takes intelligence to generate information. So when you look at an event like the Cambrian Explosion, which is not only an explosion of new animal form, but an explosion of all the information that would have been necessary to build those forms, I think you're looking at decisive evidence of intelligent design.
Mm-hmm. And so how does kind of your account of the Cambrian Explosion connect with others that are also pushing back against kind of a material reductionist neo-Darwin account? because in my head I'm thinking that there's connections but also divergence between, say, people that develop a kind of emergence theory of evolution, where they look at how quantitative changes build up, and then you have a qualitative emergence of a new stage, be it a couple dead stars to get the periodic table so that biological life could form, all the way to like quantum consistencies and patterns that enable kind of solid state physics, and they see this kind of pattern of emergence where new complexities and stuff come into being, and some of them give very theistic accounts of it, that in a sense it is an idealist account of emergence and evolution, but they wouldn't part ways with the theory as far as you do. So maybe you could say a little bit about how this connects to kind of different kind of theistic accounts of cosmology and origins that are attempting to push back against this kind of materialism and reductionism you see in the neo-Darwinists, to basically, above the DNA, there's just epiphenomena, be it the way we love our kids.
Let me give you a little typology of the positions that are out there, a little classification of them, perhaps. But one of there's a new book out this spring about the Cambrian explosion by two leading Cambrian experts, James Valentine and Doug Irwin. And they're definitely operating within the standard naturalistic framework for doing science, including science of origins. But they also recognize that the Cambrian is a really difficult problem, and the much of the scientific analysis of their book parallels my analysis, or I would probably say it more modestly that my analysis parallels theirs. They're the experts on the Cambrian itself, and so I don't think there's a basic disagreement about the facts. They in fact think that the Cambrian explosion was real, not an artifact of incomplete sampling or incomplete preservation of the fossil record. At one point, they also argue that the Cambrian needs to be understood in what they call a non-uniformitarian way, because essentially they're saying there are no known biological processes, no observable biological processes of evolution that can account for the scope and of the change that we see in the Cambrian, this massive innovation of new form in such a geologically restricted period of time. And the review of their book in Science amplified this, saying that the grand puzzle of the Cambrian explosion surely must rank as one of the most important, outstanding mysteries in evolutionary biology. So this is from the standpoint of materialistic or naturalistic evolutionary theory. It's a mystery that has not been resolved. I go further, of course, by suggesting that there is another way to look at the problem. In fact, there's no reason that we need to restrict ourselves to strictly materialistic explanations when we're addressing essentially an informational phenomenon, because we know from experience, again, that information is not the kind of thing that undirected material processes produce, but it is the kind of thing that minds produce. If you walk into the British Museum and look at the Rosetta Stone, people would think you a little daft if you said, well, gee, isn't it wonderful what wind and erosion have produced? When you're looking at all those inscriptions and you realize that they're informational in character without even thinking about it, you recognize that an intelligent scribe played a role. Now, having said that, NeoDarwinism and intelligent design aren't the only options. And so one of the things I do in the book, which is, I think, somewhat unique, is that I look at, in fact, I have two chapters describing the 5 or 6 most current non-Neo-Darwinian evolutionary theories. These are all materialistic theories. One of them is the self-organizational idea that you allude to. And I show that in each case these theories have some advantages over Neo-Darwinism, but at the same time they fail to account for the information necessary to build the Cambrian animals. Many of them actually simply presuppose either genetic or epigenetic sources of information and then describe those processes, NeoDarwinism really gives no account of epigenetic information. The current self-organizational theories are in many ways based on the observation of the observation and the awareness of the importance of these epigenetic sources. But these self-organizational theories largely presuppose those sources of epigenetic and genetic information and then describe life accordingly, but they don't account for the origin of those forms of information. So I part ways from some of those self-organizational theories of emergence in two respects. First, I show that they often presuppose what needs to be explained, and secondly, I show that they often explain well what doesn't need to be explained. What we don't need to explain in biology primarily is the emergence of what's called the spontaneous emergence of order. In information theory, order is a redundant or symmetric type of structure. A mantra would be highly ordered. If we said the same three-letter string over and over again, cat, 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 that would be a highly ordered string of characters, but it's not informational. Once you've said cat once, everything after that's redundant. And self-organizational accounts of order typically are explaining, well, precisely that kind of order. They're not explaining information, which is aperiodic, non-repeating, and yet highly specified in its configurations in order to perform a function of some kind, a communication function or otherwise. So there's a fundamental theoretical and conceptual difference between information on the one hand and order on the other. The self-organizational models, I think, do a good job of explaining spontaneous order in the universe, but they don't do a good job of explaining the origin of information, especially biological information. So I guess that's a long answer to your question.
Oh no! I think it's helpful because for people that listen to the podcast a lot, the kind of stronger theories of emergence can include God as informationally present, or in process that we talk about the lure of God present in each moment of becoming, and things like that. That at least in your book would those are more stronger forms of a kind of philosophical idealism that's is attempting to deal with these kind of different questions. In your book, you kind of emphasized like the mystery of engineering, and I thought that was a really good way of phrasing the problem. And maybe you could say a bit about it, because I think it puts it frames a question where certain long-held and then defended with a certain vehemency in public are called into question in a way that just to even ask the question, you could sound ignorant or rejecting science and stuff. So what is that question around the mystery of engineering that really problematizes, at least in the cultural experience of this debate?
Well, there's been a long-standing skepticism about NeoDarwinism, now stretching back, almost 50 years in our post-Watson and Crick era. It was in the mid-'60s that a group of engineers, computer scientists, mathematicians, physicists convened a conference with some of their biology colleagues. Many of these quantitative scientists were from MIT, some were from continental Europe and other places. And there's some really high-powered people. Murray Eden at MIT, the French mathematician Marcel Schussenberger, one of the guys who'd been involved in the physics of designing the hydrogen bomb, Ulam. I mean, these are high-powered people, and they were skeptical about NeoDarwinism on mathematical grounds, and essentially the source of their doubt was an engineering question. If you want to build a new animal, they realized you got to have new genes and new proteins. But the Darwinian mechanism purports to explain the origin of new genetic information on the basis of random changes in what is essentially a typographic, alphabetic, or digital form of information. They called it typographic. because and this flowed right out of Francis Crick, 1957. Mm-hmm. 4 years after he and Watson elucidate the structure of DNA, Crick proposes what's called the sequence hypothesis, in which he puts forward the idea that DNA contains information in a digital form. He essentially proposes the idea that the four bases that carry information in DNA are functioning much like an alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. And there are reams and reams and reams of these characters, the A's, the C's, the G's, and the T's, as chemists represent the four characters that carry the information in DNA, the four chemical bases. And the scientists, the quantitative scientists, began to challenge their biology colleagues to run numbers on their scenarios about the probabilities. And essentially they were describing what's called a combinatorial problem. If you have a byte clock with four characters, or four dials and 10 digits on each dial, you've got 10,000 possible combinations. But what if you have a byte clock with 100 or 300 dials, and instead of 10 digits on each, you've got 20? Well, essentially, that's what a protein is. It's a long chain-like molecule, and at each linkage in the chain is an amino acid. But there are 20 possible amino acids, protein-forming amino acids, that correspond to each one of those sites. And so each site could be conceived of as a dial with many digits. And if you think about a protein of 100 amino acids long, you've got 20 to the 100th power possibilities. Average length proteins are about 300 amino acids long. The number of possible arrangements so dwarfs the time available to look for them that it did not seem plausible to the scientists who convened this conference, and the conference was called the Wistar Institute Conference in 1966, that the mutation selection mechanism could search that big space of possibilities. It'd be kind of like think of a homespun example. You've got a thief outside the door, and he's, instead of finding an ordinary byte clock with 10 digits or with four dials and 10 digits, he finds one with 100 digits and 10 or 100 dials and 10 digits on each. And now there's a security guard coming around the corner. He's going to have 3 more minutes to try to find the combination at random. Is there enough time for him to search the space of all those 10 to the 100th power combinations? Well, obviously, it's not very likely at all. In fact, it's overwhelmingly more likely than not that he will fail. And in the same way, many of these mathematically minded scientists thought that it was overwhelmingly more likely than not that the mutation selection mechanism would, on cosmic time, be incapable of searching enough of the combinations to come up with to have a reasonable chance of success, and therefore they thought that the theory was much more likely to be false than true, and so they rejected it. Now, in the book, I show how this combinatorial problem has become more acute, how we've nailed it down more precisely mathematically because of some experimental work that was done in the 90s. And so basically the mutation selection mechanism does not look to be at all plausible as an explanation for the origin of the information necessary to build even a single gene or protein, let alone a whole new animal. This is the scope of the problem that's now confronting NeoDarwinism.
Mm-hmm. So how does that, and I really like the example of the lock. How does that kind of connect to what people may be familiar with of the anthropic principle, and that kind of comes up in religion and science discussions pretty often?
Well, right. There's actually a theoretical connection. I mean, anthropic fine-tuning is also essentially an information problem, or or you could think of it as a combinatorial problem. You have all these different possible settings on the cosmic dials. The dials would correspond in this case to those. Let me maybe back up. The fine-tuning of laws of constants of physics is something that physicists have been talking about since the 1960s. Is they've discovered a number of different parameters that are finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. Things like the expansion rate of the universe, the speed of light, the force of gravitational attraction, the ratio of different fundamental physical forces to each other. Turns out we're in a Goldilocks universe, that if any of those parameters were a little bit different, a little bigger, a little smaller, a little weaker, a little stronger, life would not be possible. And in a way, that is another manifestation of this same kind of combinatorial problem. There's a huge number of possible configurations of those different parameters, different combinations of possible values for those parameters. Only very few of which, an incredibly small proportion of which, will yield a life-friendly universe. And that leads to a question: well, what explains that happy coincidence? Is it chance? Is it a multiverse of other universes out there, and that we just happen to be the lucky one, or is there actually, or is this fine-tuning actually evidence of a fine-tuner, an intelligence or a designing agent that set the universe up right so that life was in fact possible? And that debate's been going on in physics. Fred Hoyle, who was one of the physicists who first discovered one of the most important fine-tuning parameters, having to do with the resonance levels of the carbon atom, said that a common sense interpretation of the evidence suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry to make life possible. Mm-hmm. I've always thought it was amusing how the monkeys made it into all the origin scenarios, even if they were about physics and cosmology. But anyway, this has been a long-standing debate. I personally think there are good reasons to prefer a theistic design hypothesis over the multi-universe concept, but that's another topic.
Well, what's interesting, I think, about the multiverse is, and I was sitting one time with Keith Ward, who's he does
very good
science.
Scholar, right.
Yeah, and a friend who's a good neo-Darwinist, and he was going on about the multiverse theory, and Keith said, well, you do realize that's what Aquinas thought, that all possible universes existed as possibilities in the mind of God, and God chose to actualize the most beautiful one. And
well, that's a design argument, and what I think is interesting. My take on the multiverse is that the reason to prefer a theistic design hypothesis over the multiverse is that the multiverse requires some account of what's generating these universes, and all the speculative or the cosmological models that physicists invoke to justify the multiverse, whether it's the string theoretic landscape or the inflationary cosmology, themselves require prior fine-tuning. In the case of the inflationary cosmology, the what's called the shut-off energy of the inflaton field must be finely tuned, and so the question of fine-tuning is not eliminated by the postulation of a multiverse. It's just kicked back one level. Mm-hmm. And that's one of several reasons, I think, to prefer a theistic design hypothesis, because eventually you get there to the need to explain the fine-tuning without prior fine-tuning. And I think what we know from experience is that when you find finely tuned systems, and finely tuned systems are actually another way of talking about information-rich systems, and so there's really a connection between the evidence of design in physics and the evidence of design in biology.
Mm-hmm. So,
but when you find finely tuned systems, or when you find information-rich systems, you invariably you come to a mind. That's what we know from our uniform and repeated experience, and that's why I think a common sense interpretation of the fine tuning has long seemed to be theistic.
Yeah. So when you take off your philosopher's hat, and people have been listening, where do you locate yourself in a faith community?
Well, I really never take off my philosopher's hat. It doesn't make it impossible to wear it and also be a person of faith. So, I'm a Christian. Probably would be defined as an evangelical Christian. I've typically found myself in attendance at Presbyterian churches, and I actually think it's a really exciting time to be both a philosopher and a scientist and a person of faith, because I think there's so much good work being done in both disciplines and so many amazing discoveries in science that I think, while not proving the existence of God in the deductive sense that the medievals were looking for, I think there are plenty of discoveries that have implications that are friendly to a broadly theistic point of view or worldview, and many of these discoveries I think were quite unexpected even 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So, when you're thinking as a philosopher and stuff, but also locating yourself as a Christian, how does the intelligent design thesis connect with kind of the particularities of the God of Abraham or the story of Israel and to Jesus, and those kind of very particularizing or thematizing this understanding of a creator? Because throughout church history, there have been people that have asked the question, like, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? So, let's say someone is persuaded by the philosophical thesis you put forth. Where do you begin a conversation to talk about the particularities of a religious tradition that centers on special revelation and not just natural revelation or the best explanatory account of the universe?
Yeah, I think it's important to be epistemologically modest in evaluating the evidence from the natural world, and I don't think it gets you to a specific theistic religion. I think the evidence from the natural world points in a broadly theistic direction, and the arguments I make in the books about biology, Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell, show that there's evidence for a designing mind of some kind. I think that that leaves open the question of the identity of the designing mind, and I do think other branches of science can help adjudicate the possible hypotheses about exactly the character of the designer. For example, from the biology alone, I don't think you can distinguish the merits of a design hypothesis that invokes an immanent versus a transcendent designing intelligence. But I think if you bring in the evidence from cosmology and physics, we were just talking about the fine-tuning evidence. I think the fine-tuning evidence shows that there's design built into the fabric of the universe from the very foundation of the universe itself, that from the beginning of the universe itself. And clearly, that type of evidence of design I don't think can be accounted for by any agent within the cosmos. And so I think if you can join the evidence of design in biology and that evidence that we find now in physics, along with evidence of a definite beginning in time for the universe itself, I think it's possible to make a pretty compelling case for a theistic designer and a basic form of theism by analyzing the evidence from the natural world. I would formulate that case as an inference to the best explanation, mm-hmm. not as a deductive proof. Having said all that, then that then leads to other questions. Well, if you're convinced of theism, then you've got other questions about how to assess which form of theism is the correct one, and I think that leads into a need to evaluate the specific claims of the different theistic religions. I think, personally, the claims of Christianity hold up best and very well, and I would actually say Judeo-Christianity, I see continuity there, and I think that I've been fascinated for a long time with the archaeological support for the historicity of the Bible, but that's a personal interest and not really relevant to the books I've been writing. But I do think that there are ways to evaluate the truth claims of the competing theistic religions as well. And some people, don't need that. They find that they can take the claims of special revelation on faith, but mm-hmm. I think the two can go hand in hand.
So how, as a philosopher of science, do you talk to scientists who, will say, Stephen, I can see your thesis as plausible and intelligent. It's just you also think that there is divine action or kind of a supernatural action and the resurrection of Christ or something like that. For a lot of people that grew up in the West, where scientific reductivism and that kind of thing is such an ideology, just the possibility of admitting possibility of divine action or intervention or anything like that, it becomes difficult. So how do you kind of relate those kind of special instances of divine action to also to people who, they're still trying to figure out if a theistic account of origins is plausible?
Well, I mean, some of this goes back to Hume and his argument against the very possibility of miracles, which I think is an argument that has now been pretty roundly criticized by philosophers of science.
Yeah.
And for good reason. I think the question of miracles is actually a very simple one. Miracles are entirely impossible if God does not exist, because a miracle is an act of divine agency or divine action. So, but miracles are conversely entirely possible if there is a God to act. So, the question, the Humean argument was that they violate the laws of nature, and yet at the same time, Hume was trying to prove that the laws of nature have no ontological status, that they're not real things, but just conventions of the mind that we form as a result of repeated experience of certain kinds. And his position, I think, was totally incoherent. But the traditional view of a law of nature is that it's actually a mode of divine action. The view that was held by the early founders of modern science, who actually probably formulated the notion of a law of nature. So, in their view, for example, in Newton's view, a law of nature was a form of what he called constant spirit action. It was God's way of ordering the physical world. And if there's a God who's ordering the physical world, that God could also make exceptions to his main mode of affecting the natural world and act in a more discreet or unexpected way as well. So, if what a law of nature is a mode of divine action, then certainly God could act in a different way for special purposes. If it's not a mode of divine action and it's merely a convention of the mind, a habit of the mind, as Hume said, well, then there's nothing. Then it isn't a real thing to stop something from happening. So either way, I don't think there's a really good, in principle, argument against miracles. And the attempt to formulate or to account for what a law of nature is apart from some sort of theistic foundation has also been very difficult in the philosophy of science. So. Mm-hmm. It's a deep question, but I'm convinced that there's no, in principle, reason that miracles couldn't happen, or that God could not act in nature, act as an agent within the structure of natural law that he otherwise sustains and upholds, and so that then questions of specific miracles become questions of the historical evidence for or against them, or the degree to which the overall revelation that provides them has credibility. Obviously not every event that's recorded in the Bible is going to have external corroboration, so it's probably for believers a question of their overall assessment of the credibility of the text.
Mm-hmm. So when last year at the American Academy of Religion in the science and religion group, there was a discussion about this, and it was interesting to see that the reason a lot of kind of Christians who do philosophy and science push back around the notion of miracles was really about the character of God and kind of the problem of evil as omnipotence creates it, right? That if God can intervene and do what God wants whenever God wants, then there's lots of historical instances of atrocity and suffering where God didn't intervene, and if we as parents didn't intervene in our kids walking in front of a car, we would be judged as a morally deficient parent. But then you have things like the Holocaust and stuff like that. And what the discussion was about of ways of understanding divine power that don't operate with this dichotomy of natural and supernatural, but re-understanding divine power as active and present, but not omnipotent within the world. So how do those kind of discussions connect with you and kind of your own intuitions with your faith, but also your training as a philosopher of science?
Well, the books that I'm writing are really about a more fundamental question, which is there any evidence of intelligent action in the history of life at all? And then the questions of theodicy and things. Well, first of all, questions of the identity of the designer, and then further questions of theodicy are really downstream in what would be called the philosophy of religion more than the philosophy of science. I'm, of course, personally interested in those questions and have my own take on a lot of them. One thing that's relevant, I think, to the work I do is this an ancient distinction within medieval and later Christianity of the distinction between the ordinary power and the fiat power of God, the potentia absoluta and the potentia ordinata, and the argument to design, or the argument for design, I think is an argument that affirms God's. If you conceive of the designer as God, it would affirm his special creative action at discrete points in the history of life, as opposed to merely his power of upholding the laws of nature. But to affirm such actions would not be to deny God's ordinary power. And I think theologically, usually people think that miracles are things that are unusual and that they are only being done for special purposes, that the mere upholding of natural law can't accomplish on its own, and that they usually have some larger theological rationale, or rationale perhaps in the mind of God that we may or may not fully understand. But that I think the distinction between the two forms of divine action, which is an ancient theological distinction, is also maps onto some distinctions in the philosophy of science between agent causation, or between agent causation or singular causation on the one hand, and the laws of nature on the other. I think that's a clear distinction you see in nature, and so I think that's maybe something that connects to your question.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think is the variables at play when if you kind of survey the country, you see that intelligent design is extremely popular, but is not as popular in the scientific community. And I even read one article that in the Middle East that intelligent design is largely supported by Muslims more than any of the kind of other cosmological accounts, but still scientifically it has a hard time getting a hearing and things. So what are the kind of things that are at play in science, but the politics of science and the politics of religion in culture?
Well, I think the scientific community in the last 150 years since Darwin has let me start over. I think within the scientific community at large, there is a kind of default way of thinking, and it's easy to understand how this could be. If you're looking, the nature of your discipline is that you're looking at the material world, you might be inclined to, even unwittingly, embrace a kind of comprehensive materialistic worldview. But one of the things I'm trying to show in the books is that you can study the material world in a very systematic and rigorous way. You can even use Darwin's own method of reasoning and evaluation for looking at ideas about the remote past, and still not affirm that the material world was caused entirely by material causes. In fact, the evidence may point in the opposite direction. And so I think because of sort of a reflexive tendency to affirm materialism, many scientists are initially unmoved and not very open to the idea of intelligent design. Having said that, what we're seeing is extremely encouraging, because the interest in intelligent design as a scientific theory is growing among scientists internationally. and there are and including in some places you wouldn't expect it, like Britain and Europe, where we're picking up a lot of support, and where we have some very prominent scientists who are now contributing to the intelligent design research program in different ways. There's a very prominent new journal, or not so prominent journal, but a journal with some very prominent members on its editorial board called Biocomplexity, which is a journal that is devoted to an open assessment of the intelligent design thesis, as well as publishing experimental results that are relevant to assessing its merits and exploring its heuristic value. And on the editorial board, there are some very distinguished scientists on both sides of the Atlantic, some members of national academies in various countries, and I think what's happening is that there's a growing scientific research community that is still obviously a minority position, but one which is growing pretty rapidly, and I think that's because these questions really are perennial, and there's so much, I think, because there's so much good evidence in support of design. Once people suspend the rule that says, hey, we're not going to consider any materialistic explanations for certain phenomena, then I think the evidence starts to look very supportive of design to a number of scientists. So one of the things we're trying to do is not only make the evidential case, but also challenge those conventions in science that say, hey, we're not going to look at non-materialistic explanations. We're going to be completely committed to methodological naturalism or methodological materialism. In both books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, I actually challenged that definition of science, which says that you're not a scientist. If to be a scientist, you must limit yourself to materialistic explanations. I want to say, no, there's certain kinds of phenomena that we know from experience aren't well explained that way, and therefore we should be open to following the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to an intelligent cause or what we might call agent causation.
Mm-hmm. So in the book, when you're kind of deconstructing a lot of the aftermath of this common ancestry theory, as you start looking at the engineering problem and all that it takes to build an animal, one of the questions that came up in my mind is then, what does it take to build a human, or how are humans unique? Part of most people that are resonating with these intuitions of intelligent design are people who think that there is more to being human than the popular story that's getting told scientifically, that there is a transcendent other with intentions to bring you about. In the past, we've early part of the Enlightenment, there was a kind of dualism, right, between the mind and the body, and humans were unique for the mind. And then in the Middle Ages, there was a discussion of the soul, that humans had an animal soul, and it gets destroyed, and an immortal one gets put in while you're in the womb, and that kind of thing. So, thinking in light of intelligent design, how do you talk about the uniqueness of humanity, or describe this sense of sacredness to the human individual, kind of in light of your theory and conclusions?
Well, I'm working in some ways the other end of the time scale in attempting to explain the origin of the first life and the origin of animal life. Humans come much, much later, but part of the research program of intelligent design is to resuscitate precisely the notion of agency and agent causation, and therefore of mind as a ontologically real thing in addition to matter. How the two interact is, of course, the deep and perhaps imponderable question of the mind-body problem. And but whether you whatever formulation of that, I think you take, one of the things we want to affirm is that we know of the reality of minds and of their causal powers better than we know anything else, because we have direct introspective experience of our own consciousness as agents, and we have direct experience of our powers as agents to produce certainly thought and probably to affect the material world around us. And so any philosophy of science that writes agency out of the or mind or conscious and rational experience out of reality is missing something really important. And in fact, the whole enterprise of science is the attempt to understand with our minds the nature of the physical world. If our analysis of the physical world leads us to the conclusion that there are no minds, we've got to stop and back the truck up a little bit and figure out where we went wrong, because we are using our minds to analyze the physical world. We know of our conscious experience, and we know of our rational deliberations and the powers of our minds better than we know anything about the physical world. Everything we know about the physical world is mediated to our minds through our senses. And so I think the tendency toward reductionism, in especially late 19th century and early 20th century philosophy and science, is something that's self-refuting, and it is a philosophical position which is actually at profound odds with the very enterprise of science itself. So one of the things that we're doing with in making arguments for intelligent design, intelligent causation, agent causation, is resuscitating the ontological foundations of the scientific enterprise itself, and that is an affirmation that mind is a reality as well as matter. And I think one of the things that's allowed us to do that persuasively is the discovery that information is a third fundamental entity in the physical world. It's not just matter and energy. There's also information. And what we know from experience, again, is that information is a product of mind. It's a mind product, not a product of undirected material processes. So our recognition that we can't really understand what's going on in biology or even in the universe without seeing the role of information, I think is helping to resuscitate that ancient tradition in science that says that the mind is a real thing, the conscious and rational activity is necessary to understand how the world came to be.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and maybe you could say a little bit about where people can connect with you, after they have gone and purchased Darwin's Doubt on Amazon and or getting it and ready to read,
or anywhere else they might choose to do it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the plug. The book is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's in the Barnes & Noble stores. They've had in-store displays about the book, which has been nice. And I have a website for the book called darwinsdoubt.com with no apostrophe in Darwin's. And I've also got a Facebook page, Dr. Stephen C. Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R. And there's stuff posted there, almost every day for people who are really into these discussions. So darwinsdoubt.com or the Facebook page for Dr. Stephen C. Meyer.
And you also have a YouTube channel with which is fun because in the book there's tons of pictures, and whoever did your sketches for
Ray Braun, terrific artist here in Seattle. Yeah, absolutely. And we've got a color insert with some of the beautiful fossils. And you and I have been having a pretty in-depth and in some ways heavy philosophical conversation, and I would just alert prospective readers to know that the book does address both the science and the philosophical issues surrounding this, but it also tries to tell a story, and I hope that makes it more readable. I used to be a college professor and taught freshmen, and used to use lots of visual aids, so you'll see that in both in the figures and the diagrams that are used to get concepts across, in the explanations, and also in the storytelling. So I hope people will find this. It's actually, to me, it's even having finished the book, it's still just a fascinating story of how reflective Darwin was and how open he was to consider both problems with his theory and the evidence that supported it on each hand, and how this doubt that he had thought of as something of a kind of minor anomaly has grown up to be illustrative of such a fundamental problem in evolutionary biology, the problem of the origin of fundamentally new form, and now we understand the problem of the origin of information itself.
thank you so much for sitting on the phone for way longer than I'm sure you expected to. I was having fun and got distracted.
Well, that's good. When I was first hired as a college professor, the guy who hired me said he hired me because he realized that when I started talking about ideas, I lost my social graces. So I like guys like you, you know. Not that you lost your social graces, but you lost track of time, which is great. These topics don't admit short sound bites, right?
No, they don't. All right. Well, I hope you have a great day, and next time a book comes out, I would really enjoy getting to talk to you again.
Well, it's nice to get to know you. Thanks so much.